The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 10th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus said to him, what is written in the law? What do you read there? He answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said to him, you have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live. But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came near the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him, and when I come back I will repay you whatever more you spend. Which of these 3, do you think, was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? He said, the one who showed him mercy. Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. The Gospel of the Lord. So as you can tell from the artwork and the posters and stuff that you see around the sanctuary and back in the narthex, the theme of the Vacation Bible School that we are getting ready for this year is road trip. Both the kids and the adults will be looking at 5 different Bible stories in which people are on the road. Sometimes they're going someplace because God told them to go there. Sometimes they're going someplace because they have to go there for some reason that may or may not seem very religious. And sometimes they're just on the road for personal reasons, but in that road trip, they unexpectedly encounter the presence of God. And when you're planning a VBS curriculum, you always try to find a theme that sounds fun and exciting. And for most of us, most of the time, the road trips that we have been on have been fun and exciting. We often go on road trips because we want to see things that we have never seen before. Because we're going to be in places that we haven't been before, we often have unexpected experiences that turn out to be some of the most memorable parts of the trip. And even when we encounter difficulties or problems on a road trip, those things provide great stories for years to come. So road trips are always memorable. And that is one of the things that made today's parable memorable to Jesus' first hearers. A lawyer, that is a professional biblical scholar who studied the law of Moses, stands up and he asks Jesus a question. And in response, Jesus tells a story. But the context of the story is a road trip. It's a trip on the road between Jerusalem and Jericho. Now, an important thing to know is that while Jesus makes up the story, he does not make up that road trip. This road trip was well known to Jesus' first audience, as the road between Jericho and Jerusalem was ancient and was often used because it was, in fact, the shortest distance between those 2 ancient cities, Jericho in the Jordan Valley and Jerusalem in the hills of Judah. But nobody wanted to be on that road. It was not a fun place to take a road trip on because, first of all, it was literally a winding road through harsh desert terrain with no water and no places to stop for help or supplies. So because it is part of the theme, this is the picture that's being projected. That is the actual ancient road between Jericho and Jerusalem. It's to the right. You're looking down towards the Dead Sea where Jericho is. There is nothing out there. There's little scrubby patches because when there's a monsoon of some kind, that's the wadi where the water goes. And it is not a good place to be if it's raining, but it's also not a good place to be in the regular time because there's nothing out there. If you get sick or injured on that road, there is nobody and nothing to help you. And while this road is only about 20 miles as the crow flies between the 2 cities, and not even crows are stupid enough to fly there, what you don't realize until you've been there or you've seen a topographical map is that the elevation difference is enormous. Jericho in the Jordan River Valley is almost 1,000 feet below sea level. Jerusalem, up in the hills of Judah, where it snows in the wintertime, is almost 2,500 feet above sea level. So it is a long, hard climb up, even if nothing else goes wrong. But the real reason you don't want to be on that road is that it was a hangout for the kinds of thieves and bandits that Jesus describes in the parable. Merchants had to travel back and forth and were easy pickings for bands of thugs who did exactly what Jesus describes happening to this poor guy. And that part of the story would not have been unusual at all. As soon as Jesus said, there was a guy on a road, on the road, because there's only one, between Jerusalem and Jericho, immediately everybody who was listening to Jesus thought of that road, and they knew people who had been on that road, they themselves had been on that road. It was not a fun road trip. Now often, as you read commentaries on this parable, commentators will wonder, why didn't the priest or the Levite stop to check on the poor guy by the side of the road? And often there are dubious and generally wrong religious explanations, which are proposed by some of the commentators. But the reality is that the goal of any road trip on that road was to get the heck off of the road as quickly as you possibly could. And so the real question isn't why the other two didn't stop, but why anybody would stop at all. And in fact, this is how Jesus flips the question. Because you notice that the question gets flipped. The question that Jesus was asked was, who is my neighbor? That is, who is the guy in the ditch? But Jesus flips it and asks the guy at the end, who was the neighbor to the person in the ditch? That is, who are you if you're traveling along on this road trip? So instead of the narrow limits of who might be worth stopping for on the road trip of your life, Jesus instead asks the question of who you're going to be as you move down the road, regardless of whether the road is long or short, or safe or dangerous. And that means that Jesus is really using this road trip to call each of us to consider not who our neighbor might be, but whether we are willing to be neighbors by living as children of God who think of ourselves as being on a journey from God. That is, to see our lives as a journey with unknown opportunities instead of a possession that we keep in our pockets. Because this is one of the differences between the Samaritan and the others. He sees the need and he sees the opportunity instead of just seeing the danger to himself and his own interest. You cannot possibly see somebody lying by the side of that road and not think, this could happen to me if I stop. He knows that. But he also sees that there's an opportunity and a need to do something different. That's part of what it means to be a neighbor. Jesus uses this image of the road trip to ask us whether we're willing to be neighbors by living as children of God who have compassion for others who have been injured on the journey. That is, not only to recognize the dangers and perils that we ourselves face, but to appreciate and empathize with those who have been the victims of those same dangers. You know, it's not finally inherently trying to find something warm and fuzzy about others, which neither Jews nor Samaritans probably felt for each other. This is another reason that Jesus probably uses the image of Jews and Samaritans. Jews didn't like Samaritans, Samaritans didn't like Jews. Nobody liked each other, and there's no suggestion in this parable that when the Samaritan sees the guy lying on the side of the road, he feels warm and fuzzy towards the guy. He's like, oh, that guy looks just like my best friend. I feel good about this. He has pity on him. He sees the need, and he's willing to help, even though he doesn't know this guy, and when he gets well, might not even want to continue to know the guy, and the feeling might be mutual. Because the point is not whether you have warm and fuzzy feelings, but whether you can empathize with people who have been injured in the same way that you yourself could be on the dangers of the journey of the road trip. And Jesus uses this image of the road trip to ask us if we are willing to be neighbors who live as children of God by being open to taking some of the detours that God may place in our journeys. That is, to be willing to adjust and change the way we thought our lives would go when God puts something important before us. And honestly, for me, and many of you know this about me, frankly, this is always one of the hardest things whenever I am on a road trip. When I'm on a road trip, I got an agenda. And I'm going there, and I'm doing it on this time schedule, and don't put any detours, don't put any extra stops there. And I know I inherently read this parable, and I think, wait, the guy had to slow down his trip, even if he was out of danger. He had to slow down his trip, he had to stop, he had to take care of the guy. But part of the question about being a neighbor is, are you willing to say, all right, I need to stop what I'm doing because God has put something important in front of me and do it. Sometimes that is what being a neighbor is all about. So one of the things that it turns out from this parable is that loving your neighbor as yourself isn't so much about your neighbor as it is about you. And the key is not to find something inherently lovable about your neighbor so you'll do it, but to understand yourself as a person God has put on a road trip. And that can be hard because, spoiler alert, this is not one of the stories we're going to look at during the VBS because it's not one of the happy road trips. But if you're on a road trip from God, whether it seems happy or not, you're a person gifted by God with opportunities and possibilities. You're a person gifted by God with the ability to have compassion for those who get caught up in the same dangers and problems you face on your road trip. And you're a person gifted by God with the freedom to make detours and stops along the way on your road trip so that you can be the neighbor God has called you to be.